What if the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history, a loss of life greater than the Titanic and the Lusitania combined, happened and almost no one remembers it? What if this catastrophe, claiming over 1,500 souls, was completely overshadowed by the death of a single man, a national hero? This is the astonishing true story of the USS Sultana, a forgotten horror at the end of America's bloodiest war. The year was 1865, the American Civil War, a conflict that had torn the nation apart and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, was finally sputtering to a close. Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. The air was thick with the exhausted relief of victory and the promise of a united future. For thousands of Union prisoners of war, skeletal, broken, but miraculously alive, the war's end meant a long-awaited journey home. They had endured the unthinkable. Places like Andersonville and Cahaba were not just prisons, they were starvation pens, breeding grounds for disease and despair. The surviving men, known bitterly as paroled prisoners or parolees, had been exchanged and were now congregating in the sprawling military encampments of Vicksburg, Mississippi, and other river towns, waiting for transport north up the Mississippi River to freedom, proper hospitals, and the arms of their families. They were the walking wounded, their bodies ravaged by scurvy, dysentery, and exposure. The race for gold and the overloaded vessel. The primary means of transportation for these thousands of men was the majestic yet fragile Mississippi River steamboat. The federal government had contracted private steamboat operators, paying a set rate per man delivered to northern depots like St. Louis or Cairo. This system, designed for efficiency, inadvertently created a deadly incentive for greed. Enter the USS Sultana. She was a typical, albeit grand, side-wheel packet steamer, built in Cincinnati, Ohio, and designed to carry a maximum of 376 passengers and a crew of about 85. Her captain, J. Cass Mason, was an ambitious man. He saw the masses of parolees in Vicksburg not as fragile human beings, but as a potential gold mine. The government was paying $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer. A fully loaded trip could bring Mason and his financial backers a small fortune. On April 21, 1865, the Sultana arrived in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Captain Mason received an order to transport a contingent of the paroled prisoners north. He knew that two other steamers, the Henry Ames and the Olive Branch, were also there, vying for the same profitable cargo. An incredible, almost unbelievable act of corruption and capacity overloading then took place. Mason, allegedly in collusion with Quartermaster Captain Reuben Hatch, a man known for his graft and notoriously bad reputation, used bribes and deceit to ensure that nearly all the available men would be assigned to the Sultana. Hatch, a man who seemed to view the suffering soldiers as mere commodities, was later revealed to have been an administrative nightmare, more focused on lining his own pockets than proper procedure. He would survive the disaster and eventually face a court-martial, though he was acquitted due to politically motivated maneuvering. The official manifest listed 1,978 paroled soldiers, plus 100 or so civilian passengers and a crew of around 85. However, the real number, according to later research, was likely closer to 2,137 to 2,427 people jammed onto a boat designed for less than 500. The men were packed in like cordwood. They were everywhere. The main deck was crammed. The hurricane deck, designed to hold only light cargo, groaned under the weight. The roof of the boiler deck was covered. Men were forced to sleep standing up, shoulder to shoulder, or in a fragile web of hammocks strung precariously between the paddle boxes. The pressure on the boat's timbers was immense, and the vessel rode dangerously low in the swollen, churning river.
The Detour and the Darkness. The Sultana left Vicksburg, a floating coffin barely held together by greed and desperation, and began its fateful journey north. The river was at a historically high flood stage, with the current raging fast and the water covering the lowlands, making navigation extremely difficult. This was a double-edged sword. The deep, fast water helped the boat's passage, but also put immense stress on the shoddy boiler repairs. On April 24th, the ship made a stop in Memphis, Tennessee, to load more cargo and coal. The men cheered. They were closer to home. They couldn't know that their fate was already sealed, an invisible timer ticking down inside the patched boiler. The Sultana departed Memphis sometime after 11 p.m. on April 26th. She was steaming north against a powerful current, pushing the boilers to their absolute limit. The air was cool and the sky was dark. Most of the exhausted soldiers, wrapped in a fragile dream of home, were asleep. Just past midnight, at approximately 2 a.m. on April 27, 1865, the unthinkable happened. About 7 miles north of Memphis, near what is now known as Woodruff's Landing, the Sultana was ripped apart by a cataclysmic blast. The faulty boiler, unable to withstand the pressure of the river current and the vessel's heavy load, exploded with earth-shattering force. The catastrophe: fire, water, and ice. The explosion was not just a single blast, it was a chain reaction. The first boiler, likely the patched one, ruptured, immediately triggering 2 more explosions. A terrifying combination of scalding steam and boiling hot water shot through the central part of the ship, instantly killing hundreds of men in their sleep and showering others with flaming coals and debris. The blast tore through the upper decks and, more crucially, shattered the central pilot house, instantly killing Captain Mason and his chief officers. Without a command structure, chaos reigned supreme. The enormous blast created a massive, uncontrollable fire, which quickly consumed the oil and cotton cargo and the light wooden structure of the steamboat. What happened next was a hellish choice for the survivors: burn to death or plunge into the freezing, turbulent river. The Mississippi, in this spring flood stage, was a terrifying enemy. It was cold, near 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was flowing with a savage, mile-wide current, choked with debris, including trees and whole logs. The river was a watery grave. Hundreds of men jumped. They clung to anything: cotton bales, floating timber, pieces of the shattered vessel. Others, weakened from years of prison camp malnutrition, could not swim and were swept away immediately. Others were dragged down by the panicked grasp of their comrades.
The image of the Sultana at this moment is one of unimaginable horror. A massive, 3-tiered structure, 1,000 feet of shoreline ablaze in the dead of night, casting a ghastly, flickering light on the mass of struggling bodies in the icy water. The air was filled with the frantic screams of the burning, the drowning, and the dying. The aftermath, overlooked by a nation in mourning. Rescue efforts were hampered by the hour and the conditions. It was the middle of the night on a wide, flooding river. The few civilian boats that heard the explosions, like the steamer USS Pocahontas and the ferryboat Alida, raced to the scene. These vessels, with their crews and a handful of civilian passengers, worked tirelessly, pulling hundreds from the frigid water. The debris of the wreck became a temporary ghastly sanctuary, with survivors huddling on the few remaining parts of the boat that hadn't sunk or burned. For those rescued, their ordeal was not over. They were brought back to Memphis, a city then under martial law, and the local population and military immediately mobilized. The survivors, suffering from severe burns, hypothermia, and broken bones, were treated in hastily converted churches and hospitals. But the tragedy of the Sultana did not shock the nation as it should have.
Its staggering loss of life between 1547 and 1800 people far exceeded the official total loss of the Titanic, around 1500, and remains the greatest maritime disaster in U.S. history. Yet it slipped almost immediately from the national memory. The reason for this astonishing lapse in history lies in a historical plot twist of the highest order. The entire nation was consumed by a grief so profound that it drowned out all other news. Just 2 weeks earlier, on April 15, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln had died from an assassin's bullet. The country was in the grip of the largest, most spectacular funeral in its history. Lincoln's body was being transported on a massive, slow, ceremonial train journey from Washington, D.C., through numerous cities, back to his home state of Illinois. Every newspaper, every editorial, every minute of public attention was focused on the martyred president. When the news of the Sultana's horrific loss reached the North, it was relegated to small columns deep inside the newspapers, often tucked between lengthy reports on the Lincoln funeral procession and the search for conspirators. The national bandwidth for sorrow had been completely exhausted by the death of the commander-in-chief. The sacrifice of the parolees, who had already given so much, was lost in the shadow of a presidential assassination. The victims of the Sultana, those who survived the war only to die on the final leg of their journey home, became the forgotten dead. Their names were often lost or confused, their bodies sometimes unidentified, their immense collective tragedy virtually erased from the American consciousness. A tale of two deaths, Lincoln and the soldiers. The sheer scale of the historical oversight is what makes the Sultana story so astounding to a modern audience. The overload, the ship was carrying over 4 times its safe capacity, a shocking failure of government regulation, and a clear demonstration of unchecked wartime profiteering. The cover-up, the official inquiry into the disaster was weak, inconclusive, and tainted by political maneuvering. The key culprit, Quartermaster Hatch, used political connections to escape the full consequences of his alleged corruption, which directly led to the catastrophic overloading. The government, eager to move past the Civil War's dark final chapters, allowed the investigation to die in bureaucratic limbo. The unintended twist. The timing of the tragedy, nestled between the assassination of Lincoln and the capture of John Wilkes Booth, ensured that a loss of life greater than any other American peacetime sinking would be entirely sidelined. The nation could only mourn one great tragedy at a time, and the weight of Lincoln's martyrdom was too heavy for the memory of 1,500 exhausted soldiers to compete against. For over a century, the Sultana disaster remained a footnote, a localized horror in the collective memory of the Midwest. No single memorial or grand monument ever arose to honor the thousands of men who died, save for small markers in scattered hometown cemeteries. Yet the true story of the Sultana is a powerful testament to the cost of war, the nature of corruption, and the capriciousness of historical memory. It is a story of men who survived the hell of combat and prison, only to be killed by the ultimate bureaucratic failure on their doorstep of freedom. The legacy of the Sultana today is an act of historical reclamation. Researchers, historians, and descendants have worked tirelessly to bring the story back into the light. The wreck of the Sultana lies buried beneath a field in Arkansas, the Mississippi River having changed its course over the past 150 years. The site of the wreck is now 2 miles from the main river channel, a silent, symbolic resting place for a horror the nation forgot to remember. The river of shadows still flows, carrying the memory of the men who were so agonizingly close to home.
The SS Sultana disaster, which occurred on April 27, 1865, is considered the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history. It was a tragedy born of a confluence of mechanical failure, dangerous overcrowding, and wartime corruption. Here is a detailed breakdown of the disaster. The steamboat and the overcrowding. The vessel. The Sultana was a wooden, side-wheel steamboat built in 1863 with a legal capacity of 376 passengers and crew. The passengers. Shortly after the end of the Civil War, the U.S. government contracted with riverboats to transport recently released Union prisoners of war, POWs, primarily from the notorious Confederate prisons of Andersonville and Cahaba, from Vicksburg, Mississippi, back north. The government offered a lucrative payment of $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer. The overload. Driven by the prospect of immense profit, the Sultana's captain, J. Cass Mason, accepted a severely overloaded manifest. When the boat departed Vicksburg, it was carrying an estimated 2,100 to 2,400 people, more than 5 times its capacity. The majority were weakened, paroled POWs crammed onto every deck, which led to the wooden decks groaning and sagging. The immediate cause, boiler explosion. The flawed repair. While in Vicksburg, the Sultana had a leaky boiler. Captain Mason, eager not to lose his lucrative cargo by delaying for a proper repair, chose a quick fix. Instead of replacing the ruptured seam, a mechanic hammered back the bulged iron and applied a temporary patch of inferior quality. The chain of events. The overcrowded vessel fighting the strong, flooded currents of the Mississippi River was already under great strain. The boats listing from side to side on the river's curves caused water to rush out of the higher interconnected boilers. The fires continued to heat the exposed metal in the empty boilers, creating hot spots. When the boat righted itself, water surged back into the overheated sections, instantly flashing to high-pressure steam. At approximately 2 a.m. on April 27, 1865, about 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, 3 of the 4 boilers exploded with a tremendous roar. The disaster and the aftermath. The inferno. The explosion instantly killed many passengers with shrapnel and scalding steam. It tore apart the center of the boat, and the upper decks collapsed onto the furnace boxes, quickly igniting the wooden vessel into a massive, uncontrollable fire. Casualties and survivors. The weakened former POWs, many of whom could not swim, were thrown or forced to jump into the frigid high-water Mississippi River. Many died from drowning, burns, or hypothermia. The death toll is estimated to be between 1,168 and 1,800, making it the deadliest maritime accident in American history. The captain, J. Cass Mason, perished in the disaster. Rescue. Help arrived about an hour later with the southbound steamer Bostana, followed by other vessels. Citizens in Memphis and Marion, Arkansas, played a crucial role in rescuing and caring for the survivors. The investigation and corruption. The disaster was not merely an accident, but was fueled by corruption. Colonel Reuben Hatch. The central figure in the overcrowding was Colonel Reuben Hatch, the Union Army's chief quartermaster in Vicksburg. Hatch, who had a history of corruption and graft, made a deal with Captain Mason for a kickback in exchange for ensuring a massive load of prisoners would be assigned to the Sultana. There were other boats with capacity that could have taken the soldiers, but Hatch ensured they all went on to the Sultana. Lack of accountability. Despite subsequent investigations, no one was ever truly held accountable. Colonel Hatch avoided a court-martial thanks to powerful political connections, including his brother Ozias Hatch, who was a close associate and financial backer of Abraham Lincoln. The news of the disaster was also heavily overshadowed by the final events of the Civil War, most notably the assassination of President Lincoln and the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. Memorials and historical societies. Due to the lack of contemporary national attention, the Sultana disaster became a forgotten tragedy for many years, but survivors and descendants worked to keep the memory alive. Sultana Disaster Museum. The museum is located in Marion, Arkansas, near the current site of the wreckage. The river's course has changed, leaving the wreckage buried under a soybean field. The museum is dedicated to telling the story and honoring the victims and survivors. Association of Sultana Descendants and Friends, ASDF. This organization holds annual reunions to commemorate the victims and survivors and preserve the history. Monuments. A monument dedicated solely to the disaster was erected by Southern survivors in Mount Olive Cemetery in Knoxville, Tennessee. Many of the dead are also buried in Memphis cemeteries, often marked with unknown soldier. Survivor stories. The stories of individual survivors often reflect the horrors, such as men fighting each other for floating debris and the sheer luck involved. For instance, one account mentions a Private William Lugenbell, who was famously saved by an alligator after killing the boat's mascot alligator and using its sturdy wooden crate as a flotation device.